So the first time that I remember it happening was when I was in high school, and I was at this party with all the people that were my friends, and I remember just like all of a sudden becoming really, really irritated with them for like, I'm not sure what happened, but I remember feeling like maybe they didn't really care that I was there. I felt like maybe they didn't want me to be there. And so I just got irritated, and I remember I packed up all my stuff, and I threw my Letterman jacket on, and I started running out the door. And some people could kind of tell that I was irritated, and they couldn't really understand why, and maybe I couldn't really understand why. But they ran out to chase me, and I remember being so angry that they chased me. Like, why couldn't you just let me go? And so I yelled some curse words at them and got in my car and drove away. And I spent the next few days just kind of laying in my bed the rest of the weekend. And not like a sulking, but more like a sadness that I felt like I didn't really have a place where I belonged. The next time I remember feeling that way, I was in college, and I had gotten this scholarship to be on the track team, and I threw shot put and discus, and I was learning how to do the hammer toss, which is so much fun. But and I was pretty well liked on the team. But I still had this like sense somewhere inside me that I didn't belong here, that nobody really cared that I was here. There were other people on the team who were better than me. They didn't need me there. And so about halfway through the semester, I stopped going to classes. I stopped going to practices. I irritated a bunch of people, but that's okay because I was irritated with them. And I just, there were whole days probably days at a time where I didn't even leave the room. And this has kind of been something that has been somewhat of a pattern in my life. One of my struggles in life, I feel, is against depression. And I share that this morning because my hope is that in my honesty and being real in front of you, that hopefully that can create a space this morning for you to feel free to be real yourself, to be honest with yourself about what your struggles are. Because I believe that we're all human here, and so maybe your struggle isn't against depression, but maybe your struggle is with anxiety, or maybe your struggle is with loneliness, or maybe your struggle is with something that you kind of longed and hoped for, that you had like a dream for your life, and as you keep working towards that dream, you keep encountering roadblock after roadblock, and nothing seems to kind of work. Things don't fit together for you. Maybe that's your struggle, that there's something that you long for, but you just don't have. Maybe your struggle is like with relationships. For some reason, it just never seems to work out between you and a significant other. Or maybe you were kind of like me in high school and you feel like maybe you don't really have friends. The people that are your friends aren't really your friends. You just don't feel like you matter to anybody. The point is that we are all here today and we have a struggle. All of us have a struggle of some sort. And I bring all of this up because the passage that we're going to be in today is really famous. It's famous for a miracle that was done in this passage. And this miracle is the one where Jesus walks on water. And that walks on water has kind of become like a phrase that we even use nowadays, like not even associated with Jesus. Like if somebody's arrogant, you say, well, they think that they walk on water. Or if somebody is like maybe in your family or your company, and there's the kind of person that is always successful, they seem like nothing holds them back. Sometimes we use a phrase that, yeah, they walk on water, they can get away with anything. We've used this phrase, walk on water, so much that it has become sort of divested, taken away from Jesus himself. But it's also, when Jesus does this miracle, we focus so much on that cool thing that he did, walking on the water, that we forget why he did it. There's a whole story that is surrounding Jesus walking on the water, and really, at its heart, it is a story about struggles. It's a story about a struggle that the disciples were having. And I think this is really important to talk about because, and this is kind of what we're going to see today, is that the way that we think about our struggles determines the damage that they do. The way that we think about our struggles determines the damage that they do. Let me kind of give you an example of that. If struggles for you are something that's scary, something that, it creates this anxiety in you, it makes you very fearful, then more often than not, what you probably will do is you'll kind of run from them. And my guess is that if that's your strategy, that you might have been running for a while. This might be how you deal with hard things in your life. And my guess is also that unless you deal with that, then you're going to keep running. And so maybe relationships, when like it starts to get serious and you become afraid of being vulnerable with somebody, you just kind of check out, you run, you leave. Or maybe at the first hint of rejection, you decide that you'll push them away first, and so you run, you leave, you get out of that situation. Maybe for you, because the way you think about it, the way you think that struggles are scary, maybe for you, you run. Or maybe for you, the way that you think about struggles is that struggles are only for people who are weak. Strong people don't struggle. And so your strategy when you encounter a struggle is you hide it. Because if somebody knew that you had that struggle, they would think that you're weak. All the while you hide it, it kind of grows and it just kind of compounds and it adds to itself and it doubles and it multiplies, and pretty soon you find yourself just completely on edge, like you're going to just explode. Or maybe for you, the way that you think about struggles is that struggles are completely overwhelming. They're unbeatable. They're not something that you can face. And my guess is that maybe you've had a lot of failures against struggles, against the thing that you're struggling with. You haven't had success in a while. And maybe you even find yourself wondering, like, what could be if I had just stood up and fought for blank? What could be if I had just chased after him or her? What could be if I just pursued this job instead of settling? What could be if I had just fought for something? The way that we think about our struggles informs how we act and react when we go through a struggle, which informs how much damage it does. And the majority of us, our basic attitude towards struggles is that we want to avoid it because struggles are painful. Because it's something that's hard. And so we develop these strategies. Maybe we run, maybe we hide it, maybe we just kind of lay down and settle for less. And we develop these strategies so that we don't have to engage in the struggle, so that we don't have to fight it. And my point this morning is that I want to help us kind of make a shift. Make a shift from avoiding struggles to seeing struggles as an opportunity for growth, for seeing struggles as something that is good. I want to move from an attitude that says, how do I get out of this, to how do I grow in this? And I think that we're going to see that in this passage today. We're going to be in Mark chapter 6, and it's at the end. And what we're going to see is three things that'll help us kind of shift our perspective when it comes to struggles. Three things, and they're going to be that struggles have to be seen, struggles are where you meet God, and struggles are for change. Struggles have to be seen. Struggles are where you meet God, and struggles are for change. And we're going to be in verse 45, picking it up here. Mark chapter 6, verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Now, a little bit of context here. If you were with us last week, you remember that we just went through the story where Jesus feeds the 5,000. It's 5,000 men, so it's actually probably like 14,000 people. He feeds them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he does this miracle, and he feeds them so much there's even food left over, because that's how Jesus works. When he wants to do something for you, it always happens in an overflow. It's never just enough. It's always more than enough. But Jesus does this miracle, and if you remember the context of that, if you were here last week, to understand this story, you actually have to go back even one more story. Jesus sends his disciples out because he's trained them, he's kind of gotten them ready a little bit, and he wants to send them out to get a taste of what ministry is like. And then they come back, and it's the season in which they've done some intense ministry. They say that they've cast out demons and healed people. They've lamented with people. They've heard people's struggles. They've met people where they're at, and that can be kind of draining. And so what Jesus wants to do is he wants to give them rest. He wants to take them out to the wilderness so he can minister to them, so that they can be refreshed after this season. But as they're traveling to the wilderness, these people, they're like, oh, that's Jesus. And the word spreads, and they come from all around, and pretty soon you have 14,000 people in the middle of the wilderness with no food. And so there's this distraction that happens from Jesus' original ministry, but it says that he's moved with compassion for the people, and so he decides to do this miracle and to minister to them. So I want you to put yourselves in the frame of the disciples. Think about if you've ever been in a season that was really hard, a season that you felt stretched, a season where you felt maybe overworked, a season where you maybe felt burnt out. where all you were longing for was rest, where all you kind of really wanted was just to hang out with your buddy Jesus and just kind of get some time away. And then all of a sudden, all this whole crowd comes and they just want to meet with him and they just want to kind of derail, it seems like, derail your mission. I don't know if you've ever been there. That's kind of the place that the disciples are in. Let's keep going here. Verse 46. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountain to pray. Jesus is always taking time out to see and to be with his Father. In verse 47, and when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. Follow the timeline here. He sends them out, and then evening comes. He's on the land. They're on the sea. In John, the book of John, it says that they've, at this point, rowed 3 or 4 miles out, so that's where the disciples are. They're on the lake. He's on the land. They're 3 or 4 miles out, and here's what happens. Verse 48, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. I want you to see their struggle, because when we see other people struggle, it can help us see our own. They are making headway painfully against the wind. So just put yourself in this mentality. You're just longing for rest. You just had this hard season. You just want to be refreshed. And then you got interrupted, another thing, and you had to disseminate all of this food to these people, and you had to do more caring. You had to do another thing that was giving. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, Jesus is sending us away. We're going to get some rest. But then another roadblock comes along. And when you're tired and fatigued and stressed already, this can be even worse. But the problem with this struggle particularly is that the Sea of Galilee that they're sailing on, all the commentators kind of stress this point, that when it gets really windy, because it's a big flat space, so the wind can kind of come in and really pick up some waves, and the wind can get really strong there. And so they're just trying to do what Jesus told them to do and kind of get away, but they encounter this other roadblock. There's a struggle. But it's not just a roadblock or a struggle. This is kind of a life-threatening situation. Mark is a very quick storyteller, kind of gives you the bullet points. But if you read between the lines and you kind of look at the other versions of the story, there's a storm happening. This is kind of a dangerous situation. And these guys they're trained sailors, they're fishermen. Many of them are. Some of them are not. But they know that this is not really great. So they're struggling. They're in the middle of this storm. And Jesus performs the first of 3 miracles in this story. He sees them. Remember, I said John says that they're 3 or 4 miles out by now, and Jesus is on the shore. He sees where they are. And this is kind of an amazing thing that I think about. It's kind of an amazing thing about God in the midst of our struggles is that he sees us. He sees us. That no matter where you are in the midst of your struggle, he sees you. I think especially when you're struggling with like loneliness, or you're struggling to fit in, or struggling that you don't belong, knowing that God sees you kind of changes things. But also, and here's kind of the point that I want to dwell on with this, if God sees you in your struggle, then it's okay to see your own struggle. I mentioned that one of the things that we like to do is to avoid struggles, and we have several strategies for that. We run away from them, we kind of hide and tuck it away, we kind of just lay over and let it go. But a lot of our strategies have to do with minimizing, denying, hiding the struggles. I think this happens as Christians because for a long time, legalistic churches taught that bad people have bad things happen to them because they do bad things. So bad things happen to bad people because of their badness. And conversely, good things happen to good people because of their goodness. And so it creates this culture in which if there's a struggle, it's because you're bad. Kind of an interesting example of this, I did a funeral about a year ago now for a guy who was about 63, I think, when he had passed, and he was developmentally disabled. He lived for a very long time for somebody with developmental disabilities. And as I was kind of getting into the family and his story, it was fascinating to me that part of his story is when he was born, the doctors, he comes out and the doctors see that he's going to be developmentally disabled, and they counseled his mom to give the baby up, because having a baby like that meant that something was bad about your family. It was a cultural shame. And they had made these institutions that you could send these babies to, and then they would grow up in the institution. Lifespan was like 24, 30 years at the most. And this is what you would do back in the day. Because if you had a struggle, it meant that you were bad. It meant that you had done something that God is punishing you for, or it meant that you had messed up in a certain way, and whatever it is, you deserved it. And so they created this whole system in which you could kind of get rid of your struggles. You could hide them so that nobody could see it. Um, I was sitting down with a really smart kid, and we were talking about problems. So, maybe a few months ago. And we're specifically talking about how it's hard to face our problems, how it's hard to look at them, because that means that you have to see it, because that means that you have to see it for all that it is. You have to have courage to face your problems. And he told me this story. He's in business classes. He told me this story of this company. I think it was a bank. In the mid-'90s. And kind of what happened was the CEO was a very strong, powerful leader type, and he had kind of created this culture of fear in the company. And he did that by basically, if you failed, he would fire you. And he created this culture of, if you fail, you don't deserve to work here. And so kind of just get that mindset for a second. If you struggle, if you mess up, then what that means is you're the kind of person that can't work here. And what ended up happening was the company started tanking. They were hemorrhaging money like crazy. And the board kind of fired him because they're like, well, he's clearly not doing a good job. So they hired this new CEO, this young guy. He walks in and immediately figures out what's happening. Because the culture was such that if you made a mistake, you were fired, nobody told the CEO about their mistakes. So all these departments are having trouble. They're struggling. They're having problems. And what they're doing is they're hiding it. And so the company is hemorrhaging money, and they're lying, and they're telling the CEO that everything's fine. So on paper, it looks great, but in reality, they're hemorrhaging money. And so what the new CEO did is he comes in and he gets all of the VPs and the presidents and all the directors all together, and he writes on the whiteboard, no problems, no progress. And his whole thing was creating a culture in which we bring problems to the table so that we can deal with them, so that we can actually solve things and make progress and move forward, instead of having a culture where we deny and keep them back. I think sometimes our lives become like that, where we have something that we struggle with, something that's shameful, something that we just don't want to look at. And so what we do is we binge on Netflix, we binge on ice cream, we binge on whatever, and all in this attempt to kind of avoid dealing with this struggle. But the problem with that is it keeps growing. And what I love about this passage is that Jesus sees that they're struggling. And you might think, these guys are fishermen, they're pros, they got this all down, they got this on lock. You might be tempted, like maybe you do with your own problems, to minimize the struggle in the situation, but Jesus sees that they're struggling. He acknowledges it. If you can't acknowledge your struggles, you'll never grow from them. If you can't acknowledge that you struggle, you'll never overcome it. Jesus sees the struggle. Let's look at the next one. So Jesus' struggles are to be seen. The next one is that the struggle is the place where you meet God. This is verse 48. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch in the night, so just understand this, the fourth watch is like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so they have been rowing probably all night, on top of the fatigue and exhaustion, on top of the maybe the nervousness, the like, are we going to make it through this storm? They've been rowing all night. So they're spent. But this is the best part. At the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. He came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, which I think is hilarious. Jesus, why? But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out. There's something also kind of humorous about a bunch of men going, ah! For they all saw him, and they were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them, and he said this, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them. Struggles are the place where we meet God. Actually, maybe a better way to say that is struggles are the place where God meets us, where God comes to get us. I love that phrase. After the fourth watch of the night, he came to them. He came to them. This is something that's actually kind of consistent throughout all the scriptures. I actually love how David puts it the best. David was a poet in the Old Testament. He wrote a bunch of songs and poems about how he experienced God. And this is from Psalm 18. Can we put that up there real quick here? That'd be the next slide. He says this, "In my distress, I called upon the Lord." He's in a struggle. "To my God, I cried for help." And this is how God responded. "From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry reached him in his ears." Next slide. "Then the earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations of the mountains also trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, a devouring fire in his mouth. Glowing coals flaming forth came from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. Out of the brightness before him, hailstones and coals of fire broke through his clouds. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the voice of the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent forth arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. Then the channels of the sea, I love this, then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Lord, at a blast of breath from your nostrils. He sent from on high, and he took me. He drew me out of many waters. David kind of sees this scene as he is saved by God, as God meets him in his struggle. The way that he experiences is this. He sees that he calls out to God, and God hears him from his temple. God sees that he's in the struggle, and then he comes. And the way that he comes is with power and might and majesty, so much so that you know that David had to know that his struggle wasn't as big as that God. Elsewhere in Psalm 50, David says this. This is 50 verse 3. Our God comes. He does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire. Around him, a mighty tempest. David imagines God coming to him as a dread warrior, as somebody who has come to save him. And this is David's experience over and over. But this isn't just David's experience. This is also everybody else's experience in the Bible. We see that the Israelites are they're delivered from Egypt. So God sees them in their struggle, comes and delivers them. And then they're sent into the wilderness. And I don't know about you, but I'm the kind of person that when I'm walking into the desert, and I've never done this before, but I know it. But when you're walking in the desert and you have literally maybe 2 million people, according to some estimates, the first thing on my mind is, what are we going to eat? And here's the thing. God, in order to give them that comfort and assurance that he's there, he appears in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. It's this idea that in your struggles, God is with you. God is with you. I want to show you this. I want to introduce you to somebody. This guy, his name is Lex Gillette. Anybody heard of Lex Gillette? So Lex, part of his story is when he was in high school, he learned that he could run really, really fast. And he loved running. He loved running fast. I don't know if you've ever been into powerlifting or been in a sport, but there's kind of something that happens when you're performing at full blast on max capacity. It feels really good to see what you can do, to see what your body is capable of. That was kind of how Lex was. He pushed himself to the limit, but the problem was that Lex had a struggle. Lex is actually blind. And so he had difficulty, he'd have to run in an open space. But he believed that God had given him this talent. He believed that this was something that he was supposed to do. And so what he ended up doing was he tried out for the track team. And the coach is like, well, Lex, you are fast, but you can't stay in a lane because you don't really know where you are. You're going to hit the other runners. I can't have you do sprints. And the track is curved. And so, Lex, I can't really have you run in a circle because you won't know when it begins to curve like that. And he said, Lex, high jump is really difficult because you got to know exactly where that bar is so that you can, arch your back and flip over it. And Lex said, well, what about long jump? And the coach is like, I don't know, man. I don't know if you can figure it out. I don't know if you've ever seen somebody do long jump. But basically what happens is you stand at the end of a long track. It's about 50, 75 feet long. And at the end of the track is the pit. It's a sand pit. And what you do is you run as fast as you can at the sand pit. And at the last second, there's a little board, and you jump as hard as you can, and you fly through the air as far as you can. And that's long jump. Whoever can jump the furthest wins. So Lex had a problem that he was blind. That's his struggle. And what he found out is that he always recognized his friend's voice in high school. And so he had this idea to maybe not run away from this struggle, to maybe not hide this struggle, to maybe not just lay down and give up against this struggle. What Lex decided to do was to get his friend to help him. He knew that he could do it if somebody would just be with him in that moment. And so what his friend does is he takes him to the end of the runway and squares his shoulders towards the pit. And then Lex waits. And his friend walks to the end, and he stands right in front of the pit. The sand's right behind him. He's on the runway. And what he does is he shouts to Lex to let him know that he's in place. And then Lex gives him a signal that he's ready to run. And then what his friend starts doing is he starts shouting. And Lex runs towards his voice because he knows that if he can just pick his friend's voice out of the crowd, then maybe he can run towards that voice. And the thing that he yells is so amazing. He yells, "Lex, fly, 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 fly." And Lex comes sprinting down the runway as fast as he can. At the very last second, when Lex can hear that voice so close, his friend steps out of the way. And Lex knows when he hears his friend's voice shift, he knows that's when you jump. And he jumps, and he actually is really good at it. He went to the Paralympics. He's won bronze and silver medals the past few Paralympics. But this is a story of a man who knew that he could do it, who knew that he could overcome his struggle as long as he had somebody to do it with him. What if you in your struggle knew that somebody was with you? Part of the science of struggles is that we often think that we're the only ones who struggle. We think that we're alone in them. But consistently in Scripture, what we see over and over and over again is that we're not alone. We have a friend. And he's not just a friend, he's the God of the universe. The God who created, who spoke the earth into motion, who in the Old Testament says he birthed the mountains, who it says in Psalms that he touches the mountains and they light on fire, the God who placed the stars in the sky. And sometimes we think that struggles are too much for us. My hope for you is this morning is that you would know that in your struggles, in it, not around it, not running away from it, in it is God waiting for you to help you overcome. And when you realize that, it kind of changes things. It helps you then to face your struggles with courage. Jesus says to his disciples, "Take heart, don't be afraid." He says, "It's me." And then he steps into the boat with them. I love that imagery. He doesn't walk around them. He doesn't walk away from him. He steps into the boat with them. He steps into the struggle. The struggle is a place where you meet God. Finally, this is the last point. The struggles are for change. This is verse 51. It says he got into the boat with him, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. Pay attention to that word. They were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. I want you to see that this situation, this struggle, produces a deep change in the disciples. They go from a place where they didn't understand about the loaves and the fish to being utterly astounded. This struggle produces a change for them. Now, here's what that means, that they didn't understand and their hearts were hardened. When Jesus does this miracle with the loaves and the fish, he feeds 14,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. When it says that they didn't understand, I think that they have a very natural reaction. If you were there and you just keep going back, and there's another basket full of loaves and fish, and you're like, okay, that's a lot, and you take it to some people, and then you come back, and oh my gosh, there's another basket, and you just keep carrying baskets to people, and you do that like literally all day. It might be easy to think, it looked like we started with 5 loaves and 2 fish. I don't know how he did that, but he must have got it from somewhere, right? Because this is I don't understand how this could work. He couldn't have made 5 loaves and 2 fish into all of this food. It's impossible. He couldn't have done it. And so it says that some of them didn't believe. They didn't understand. And this is something that's interesting about belief. When you don't understand, it's hard to believe. And this is something that's so true in our struggles, that when we don't understand why we're struggling, when struggles are meaningless, when they're not pointing you towards something, when maybe you don't believe that God meets us in our struggles, that they're for something, what can happen is that we begin to not believe in anything. We begin to lose hope, because if it's not meaningful, if we're not going somewhere, if this doesn't help us sometime in the future, then what's it all for anyway? But so the disciples are their hearts are hardened. They didn't understand. They didn't believe. But then they had this miracle that was undeniable. They've been rowing all night. They know that there's wind. They know that there's a storm. They know that there's waves. And when Jesus steps in the boat, it's done. And so what literally happens is their minds are blown. And I'm talking really blown, like blown, and then those little pieces are blown. Because this is kind of amazing. The Greek here is I think I'm really nerdy, so maybe you won't think it's fascinating, but I'm like, whoa! The Greek here, when it says that they're utterly astounded, it's actually this Greek phrase. And it's 3 words, and the first word means that they were exceedingly astounded. They were not just to the limit, exceeding that limit, kind of like an overflow. They had an overflow of astonishment. The second word is out of, and the third word is another word that means the same thing as the first word. They had an astonishment that was overflowing. And so it kind of literally reads that that their astonishment was like an overflow out of an overflow. And I think this is, I don't know if you've ever done this before, but have you ever like poured too much into your cup and it overflowed? Have you ever been like maybe like me and you're just kind of absent-minded and you're just kind of looking away and it kind of overflowed out of the cup and then maybe it also overflowed out of the saucer and then your wife yells at you. Oh, this is probably just me. Pay attention! There's an overflow out of an overflow. What you have to see is what this struggle produced for them. They went from a place of doubt and disbelief to a place of overflow out of overflow, because that's kind of how God works, especially when he meets us in our struggles. I don't know if you've ever had a time where you were struggling with something and you read the right verse, or somebody said the right word, or we played the right song on a Sunday morning, and something just kind of spoke to you. But it didn't just like, oh, that's nice. It wasn't just like, oh, that's helpful. That's brilliant. Thanks, God. See you next week. I don't know if you've ever had a time when it was like an overflow, when something within you shifted and changed it, and all of a sudden it just came out in some way. Maybe you couldn't even control your tears. Maybe you're the kind of person who does this when we worship, and you found yourself doing a little bit of this, you know? Maybe something overflowed and you couldn't even control it because it's an overflow out of an overflow. That's how God works, and that's how struggles work. They move us, they change us. And there's a lot of ways that this works. One way is that when you see God meet you in your struggles, you, like the disciples, begin to believe that there is a God. Oh, he's there. He met me. He's changed some things. I see him now. And so it can help you grow in that way. But I think one of the number one ways that struggles help you grow is that struggles pull out what's already in there. Somebody once said that you don't know the flavor of tea until you put it in hot water. There's something about being in the struggle that pulls out the bad stuff that we already have deep inside of us. And so if you find yourself going through struggles and you respond with hatred, with malice, with anger and rage, or maybe you respond with shame and sadness and depression, or maybe you respond with fear and anxiety, what that struggle did is it pulled that thing out of you. And now you can see it. And when you can see it, you can deal with it. And you can take it to God and you can see him calm your storm. I'm going to bring the band up, but I want to kind of end with this. I want to end with two things: trust and courage. Trust and courage. If we're going to make this shift from seeing struggles as something to avoid, if we're constantly asking the question, how do I get out of this? And if we're going to shift into asking the question, how do I grow in this, instead of trying to get yourself out of it, if we're going to make that shift, I think two things that we're going to need is trust and courage. There's this song that we're going to sing next, and it's all about trusting God when he calls you into something. It's all about trusting God when he calls you out onto the water, which is kind of what's happened to the disciples. There's some really interesting imagery here. There's the disciples, they're on the land, and Jesus has just done this miracle, and then what Jesus does is he sends them over water to another place on the land. I don't know if maybe you feel like you're in an in-between space, you know, like where you came from something sure, and you know where you want to go, but right now it's confusing. There's some wind and there's some waves, and you're not sure if you're going to make it. I don't know if you're in a season in which the struggle has kind of grown and it's compounded and you feel like maybe it's something that you can't deal with. I wonder if you're in a season in which you just need to meet God in the midst of this struggle. We're going to sing this next song, and I'm going to actually ask you to go ahead and stand up. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but it used to be that you would, when they taught you to pray, you would get on your knees and you'd hold your hands like this. And the reason for that is that this is like a sign of desperation. It's begging. I wonder if you'd be comfortable this morning, just as you stand here, just raising your hands just like this. Just as a sign of, God, I need you. God, this storm is too strong. God, this weather is so confusing. God, you sent me to do this, but there's this roadblock again. And I wonder, as you sing this next song, if you would just keep this posture. It's a way to say with your body, God, I trust you. I'm desperate for you. I want to trust you even when it's hard. God, I need courage to face this with you. I wonder if you would just hold this posture right here. And even if maybe this isn't hitting you at all, maybe hold it for those around you so that they know that it's okay. It's okay to be struggling. That's what community is about. We're here for each other. So let's go ahead and sing this next song, just hands up like this.